It's 1937 and you're just an average German who's won the opportunity of a lifetime. First-class accommodations aboard Nazi Germany's premier airship, the Hindenburg. The Hindenburg is the height of luxury, a 60-plus flight veteran of the world's first airline, DELOG, which stands for something in German that we don't feel our narrator gets paid enough to pronounce. She sports a luxury cabin for every one of her passengers, and she's also the fastest way to cross the Atlantic and get to America. Gee whiz bang, you say to yourself in Nazi, the opportunity of a lifetime. But wait, you think? Isn't hydrogen a highly flammable gas that could end in catastrophic incineration of the airship and a horrible fiery death for all of her crew and guests? Nah, you decide it's 1930 and man is a technological god by now, master and commander of all he surveys. Why, just a few years ago, some fellas came out with a color-talking picture. Hello, future. Hydrogen is nothing to worry about. Soon, though, you'll discover that hydrogen is in fact something to worry about keenly. But what led to one of the most horrific airship disasters in history? A tragedy so shocking that it brought the golden age of airships to a screeching halt. The first airship was built by Frenchman Henri Giffard in 1852 and featured a simple 3-horsepower steam engine that would in turn spin a large propeller, giving the airship a speed of 6 miles per hour. The first true Zeppelin, though, would fly late in the 1800s and would get its name from German Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, who pioneered the use of airships to ferry passengers. Eventually, transatlantic service to America was made possible, with the Graf Zeppelin pioneering the first of many such flights. In the 1900s, there were two options for lifting airships. The first was to use helium, which was much safer as helium is not flammable. Unfortunately, helium was not widely available, and the only large-scale industrial processes to create helium existed with the many oil refineries of the United States. This difficulty in producing helium made the gas incredibly scarce, and the United States quickly adopted legislation to ban the export of helium outside of the US. Hydrogen was much more widely available and was much easier to make. This made the gas cheaper and much more in vogue to use for airship construction. Hydrogen, however, came with the famous drawback of being extremely flammable, and all it would take for an airship to end up with disaster, as the Hindenburg would find out, was a stray spark. To prevent this, though, many measures were taken, including covering the skin of the lifting body with non-flammable material and keeping the gas separated into different compartments. Some airships, mostly American in design, featured a hydrogen core surrounded by helium. Hydrogen may have been more dangerous, but as we said, it was cheaper and it provided more lift than helium. Despite many reservations, the Germans, who led the way in airship manufacturing, decided that given their exemplary safety record, they'd go ahead with continuing to make hydrogen airships. Despite this, though, the Hindenburg was originally meant to be lifted by helium rather than hydrogen. Designed in the 1920s, German builders hoped that as the Zeppelin neared construction, the American ban on exporting helium would be lifted. When US Congress refused to do so, the Hindenburg was quickly redesigned to be lifted by hydrogen. Because hydrogen had more lifting power than helium, though, the Hindenburg could afford larger and more spacious accommodations. The ship featured luxury cabins and a grand dining room with an aluminum grand piano featuring ivory keys crafted from the tusks of murdered elephants. Because it was 1930 and smoking was good for your health, the ship even included a smoking room where you could join others and freely smoke your cigars and cigarettes. But wait, smoking inside a vehicle lifted by 7 million cubic feet of extremely explosive gas? Yes, we hear your questions already. And it turns out the citizens of the 1930s weren't completely insane, and thus the room was pressurized so that no hydrogen gas could leak in, and a busboy would carefully check each occupant for lit cigarettes, cigars, or pipes as they exited. On May 3, 1937, the Hindenburg set off on its last flight, lifting up into the air with 36 passengers and 61 crew. The ship famously made for such a smooth ride that passengers often didn't even realize they'd already lifted up into the air until they looked out a window, still believing themselves to be moored to the ground. On this trip, the Hindenburg would set off for the English Channel and then to open sea, crossing the Atlantic in half the time of the fastest steamliner, or about 4 days. Aboard the Hindenburg, the passengers settled in for the trip. The cabins may have been luxurious, but they were still small, and the ship's designers expected that passengers would spend most of their time in the public spaces, of which there were plenty. Large public rooms featuring tables and couches flanked the cabins on the upper deck, with a dining room to port and a lounge and writing room to starboard. On the lower deck were washrooms as well as areas for the crew and of course the famous smoking room. All in all, the Hindenburg offered all the accommodations of a luxury steamliner, though passengers would have to forego the large outdoor decks of a steamship because after much careful consideration, the Hindenburg builders decided that passengers being blown off the ship to their deaths thousands of feet below would be bad for repeat business. In lieu of exterior spaces, large slanted windows ran the length of both decks, giving an incredible view of the peasants below, stuck walking around on their dumb peasant feet while the rich elite floated serenely through the heavens. After a departure at 7:16 p.m., the Hindenburg flew over Cologne and then crossed to the Netherlands before finally turning east to the English Channel. By 2 a.m. the next day, it was already making its way past the white cliffs of southern England and making for open sea. Because the Earth is round and not flat like a bunch of misinformed people believe, the Hindenburg followed one of the several trajectories that typically arced up north. This time, the ship flew to the southern tip of Greenland and then south again, crossing into North America over Newfoundland. Unfortunately, strong headwinds delayed the ship's passage by nearly a full day, and this might have proven fatal. If the Hindenburg had arrived on time, it may perhaps avoided the atmospheric conditions that led to its ultimate doom. On noon of May 6th, the ship had reached Boston, and because Boston has very little worth looking at, it quickly made its way up to New York City, where by 3 p.m. it was floating serenely over the skyscrapers of New York City. The ship then flew south and arrived at its final destination, the Naval Air Station at Lakehurst, New Jersey, arriving there around 4:15 p.m. When the Hindenburg got there, however, the weather concerned the ship's captain, Max Pruss. Lakehurst's commanding officer recommended that the ship wait out the foul weather, and so Captain Pruss ordered the ship to fly over New Jersey's coast for a few hours. With improving conditions, Lakehurst sent the Hindenburg a radio call relaying temperature, pressure, visibility, and winds, signaling that conditions were suitable for landing. At 6:22, Lakehurst radioed again saying recommend landing now. The break in the storm was quickly lapsing. By 7:08, Lakehurst sent another message urging the ship to land as early as possible. Pruss was already on approach though and soon had made a pass over the field at an altitude of 600 feet so he could observe conditions on the ground. With the wind blowing in from the east, Pruss ordered the Hindenburg to conduct a wide left turn in a descending oval pattern, bringing the ship down with its nose to the wind. As the ship made its slow left turn and reversed power from its engines, hydrogen gas was vented to reduce the ship's buoyancy and help bring it down to the ground. First Officer Albert Samt, however, soon noted that the ship's tail was dipping lower than the bow and thus ordered that the hydrogen be vented from 5 cells in the bow in order to bring the bow down and keep the ship in level trim. Yet the tail continued to dip low, and so Samt ordered that the water ballast totaling 2,420 pounds be dropped from the tail, and then vented an additional 5 seconds of hydrogen from the bow's gas reserves. Still though, the ship's tail remained heavy, and so Samt ordered 6 crew members forward to add their weight to the bow. As the ship continued its descent and First Officer Samt fought to keep it level, the wind suddenly shifted directions from the east to the southwest, forcing Captain Pruss to execute a risky maneuver. With worsening weather, the captain was eager to land the ship, and it was already close to the mooring mast, so the Hindenburg executed a very tight S-turn in order to change the direction of the ship's landing. Some people believe that this sharp S-turn is what ultimately sealed the Hindenburg's fate, as a bracing wire snapped from the stresses on the body of the ship and slashed open a gas cell, venting hydrogen. At last, though, the ship reached its mooring mast and the landing ropes were dropped at 7:21 p.m., with the Hindenburg 180 feet above the ground. One of the landing party, however, noticed a wave-like fluttering of the outer cover on the port side near one of the gas cells. He would later recall that it appeared to him as if gas was pushing against the cover, having escaped its holding cell. Another ground crew member at the top of the mooring mast also testified to the subsequent investigation that he saw the same covering fluttering loosely. Just 4 minutes later, disaster struck. After many investigations, most believed that an electric spark caused by atmospheric conditions and the ship's own electrical charge set fire to the escaping hydrogen. Whatever the source, at 7:25, ground crew saw flames originating from the top of the hull just forward of the vertical fin, very near the area where 2 ground crew had seen the cover fluttering. Within seconds, the tail of the aircraft was seen to collapse inwards and then spring into flames. Passengers aboard the ship heard the muffled explosion and began to see flames devour the rear of the Hindenburg, yet there was very little they could do to escape. The fire spread quickly, fueled by the massive store of hydrogen keeping it aloft. Flames then erupted from the bow, incinerating the 12 crew members stationed there and the 6 men that First Officer Samt had sent there to try to level the ship. Molten aluminum and collapsed girders began to rain down on the field below the Hindenburg, injuring some of the ground crew. As the ship began to lean backwards, crew and passengers tumbled against each other in the walls, furniture pinning them in place in some cases. In less than a minute, the Hindenburg crashed down into the field below, the flaming wreck too hot for rescuers to approach. Incredibly though, some of its passengers and crew did survive. Some had jumped for their lives from open windows. Of those jumpers, many didn't survive the fall. Crew and passengers who were watching the descent from the public rooms on A deck had the highest survival rate, with life and death decided by where one happened to be as the fire broke out and the ship tumbled out of the sky. In all, the Hindenburg had left Germany with 97 crew and passengers, and astonishingly, only 13 passengers and 20 crew died, along with one member of the ground crew. Airships had crashed before and often with greater fatalities. The American airship Akron had crashed out at sea, killing 73, and the British R-101 had crashed and killed 48. The public had been largely unfazed by these accidents, and airship travel remained popular. Yet though the Hindenburg had less fatalities, it did have one extraordinarily bad stroke of luck: the presence of a film crew who had been filming the ship's descent. Within days, millions of people had seen footage of the giant airship being consumed in flames and crashing to the ground. And many today remember the famous commentary by radio reporter Herbert Morrison, who exclaimed, "Oh, the humanity!" Interestingly enough though, that commentary was not cut together with the footage of the crash until many years after. Thanks to the massive publicity of the crash, airship travel ended almost overnight. Passengers no longer felt safe riding in massive balloons filled with explosive gas, even though airships generally had a rather impressive safety record. Instead, humanity ditched the single most elegant form of travel ever invented for the airplane, and nothing bad ever happened in the sky again. How would you have tried to survive the Hindenburg's crash? Would you ever travel on an airship? Let us know in the comments, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more great content.